This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. Let's start with a quick run to the markets here for you. Some interesting developments over in East Africa. The largest listed firm at the NSE has had a very strong run over the last couple of sessions. It's gone as high as 39 shillings and 25 cents today. Analysts at Genghis Capital expected to rise to actually 40 before the 5th of March. It's going to be a record price, including today's levels, as investors are apparently scrambling for a slice of the interim dividend that the firm announced just last week. Now, given the expectation that most other firms here, including banks, will likely not be paying dividends, the scramble for Safaricom is essentially pushing the price to the levels we're seeing now. Here's what's coming up tonight. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala makes history as the first woman and the first African to head the World Trade Organization. We'll explore why Nigeria's central bank is cracking down on cryptocurrencies. And the Japanese economy has expanded more than expected in the fourth quarter of 2020. All that and more in the pipeline for you tonight. But let's start, of course, with arguably one of the day's big stories. The World Trade Organization's General Counsel has appointed Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as the trade body's Director General. The former Nigerian finance minister makes history on several fronts. She's the first woman and the first African to lead the WTO. Now, the WTO has had a bit of a leadership crisis in the second half of the year. It's lacked a permanent substantive Director General ever since Roberto Azevedo resigned in August amidst the organization's increasing entanglement in the US-China trade disputes. WTO members took the decision to appoint Okonjo-Iweala at a special General Council meeting following a selection process that included 8 candidates from all over the world. Now, the Trump administration had repeatedly blocked Okonjo-Iweala's appointment as WTO head, arguing that she was soft on Chinese trade practices that it argued were unfair, and they preferred the South Korean candidate, the Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee, instead. Nevertheless, Yoo resigned from the race on the 5th of February, leaving Okonjo-Iweala unopposed. Now, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has been a major achiever in Nigeria and in her international postings as well. Here's CGTN's Deji Badwas taking us through some of her accomplishments.
Now, let's start with something very, very remarkable that she did that is still being practiced in the country today. Before she became the finance minister, people just didn't know what was, how much was allocated to their states or local government areas. So what she did was to ensure that every month, whatever was allocated from the federal post now to the various states of the country and the local government areas was published. So now people have a clear idea of how much their states actually get every month, so they can actually follow the money, and when their governors are not doing well, they can ask questions. That is an enduring legacy from her time that the current government is still practicing. Another thing she did wonderfully well was she spearheaded efforts now by Nigeria to secure debt relief from the Paris Club. Nigeria got about was able to save about $18 billion from that. That is, people are still talking about that till date. And you look at what she did internationally as head of Gavi, for instance, spearheading efforts to ensure that low-income countries, for instance, have access to vaccines now, different vaccines. Talk about polio vaccine, the immunization, polio immunization that took place across not just Nigeria but across Africa. So she was actually instrumental in in Africa's fight against polio and in securing that certificate, that free polio status for Africa. So she did quite a lot, especially her work for low-income countries while she was head of Gavi, and also when she was managing director of the World Bank. People are still talking about that till date. And it's all of these achievements, Hannah, that are actually standing her in good stead. And it's a reason why not just Nigerians, but across Africa and across the world, everyone wants her to head this organization.
All right, then. So that's the biography of Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. But has trade policy and attitudes towards the WTO really changed in Washington now there's a new president? Let's find out. Jim Spellman joins us from Washington, D.C. with perspectives on this story. So, Jim, the Trump administration vehemently opposed to using the WTO as a trade negotiation and dispute resolution hub. But now that there's a new president in charge, has Washington's attitude to the WTO changed? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think so. And I think you'll see a commitment from the Biden administration to trying to work more within the WTO organization. Now, that will include calls for reform, but I think we'll see an end to this confrontational approach where the Biden administration time and again tried to tear down the World Trade Organization. The nominee, Joe Biden's nominee to be U.S. Trade Representative, Katherine Tai, she actually argued cases in front of the WTO when she was in the Obama administration. She understands the organization. She understands how it works. She understands perhaps where, from the U.S. perspective, there's a need for reform as well. But I think we can assume that we're going to see an end to this sort of bomb throwing when it comes to the WTO that we saw under the Trump administration. Part of Joe Biden's larger commitment to multilateralism on the world stage, and especially in this time of pandemic, I think the Biden administration view is that they will need more friends than they're going to need people they're arguing with on the world stage. And any place where world leaders, countries come to meet, including the WTO, he's going to seek to build on relationships there instead of trying to increase confrontation as we saw under Trump.
Indeed. Okay, so let's take one specific example with the question of vaccines. The United States is among a handful of countries that are opposed to the idea of a partial suspension of intellectual property rights on the manufacture of drugs and vaccines used to treat COVID-19. Why?
Yeah, so look, Joe Biden and his administration could use U.S. law to force U.S. pharmaceutical companies to share their intellectual property so that any company around the world with the capability could produce the vaccine. But so far he hasn't done that, and here's why. First, he simply wants these companies focused 100% on creating the maximum amount of vaccine for Americans. Joe Biden knows he'll face some criticism on the world stage for that. He's willing to take it. No sign that they're going to change course on that. And second, he needs to have a good relationship with these American pharmaceutical companies. Even when most Americans are vaccinated by, say, the summertime, this pandemic will be far from over. We could need booster shots. It could be the kind of situation where we need an annual vaccine. He doesn't want it to burn any bridges with these companies going forward. So at this point, he is pressuring them, perhaps lightly, to share this intellectual property, but not compelling them. And it's working to a degree. Moderna has agreed to not enforce its patents during the pandemic, and it says it will license its intellectual property once the pandemic is over. We could see other companies follow suit, but don't expect Biden to make this a huge priority for his administration until many more Americans have received the vaccine. This comes with a risk, though, a risk that China could further fill this leadership role when it comes to vaccines on a global stage. That also would undercut Biden's claims to be pursuing a multilateral approach to U.S. foreign policy. Ramah?
Indeed. One last question for you, Jim. So the U.S. has finally, of course, backed Okonjo-Iweala's bid to become Director General of the WTO. They backed her. The South Korean candidate essentially dropped out of the race. But will the Biden administration also end the objections that we saw under Trump to the appointment of judges to the WTO appellate body as well? And if so, when?
Yeah, well, we think that they will lift those objections and enabling that body to once again do its job. But there's no huge rush here. First, they want the nominee to be the U.S. Trade Representative to be confirmed by the Senate and for her to have her key people in place before moving forward. This also could wait to a larger review of U.S. trade that's going on, but that's not expected to be completed until the summertime. As far as getting the trade representative in place, that could pick up steam here. With the second impeachment of the former president completed, Joe Biden can now get the attention of the Senate once again, and she'll need Senate approval to be confirmed to that position. Ramah?
Indeed, interesting times. So let's see how the policy side of it plays out. Jim Spellman in Washington. Thank you. Now on to North Africa. Egypt has announced that it will not be issuing any more Eurobonds for the current fiscal year, which comes to a close in July. That announcement comes days after Cairo sold $3.75 billion worth of bonds just last week at the international market, aimed at partially reducing its fiscal deficit. From Cairo, here's Yasser Hakim.
Egypt has been frequently tapping the Eurobond market in the last few years, including the highest bond sale in its history of $5 billion that was raised in August 2020. According to the North African State's central bank, the long-term international bonds are gradually replacing Egyptian pound-dominated treasury bills to avoid crowding out private investors.
Egypt prefers foreign bonds over local bills for several reasons. First, because they have a long-term repayment plan that could stretch 40 years with lower interest rates than the local debt, while the maximum period for treasury securities is only 20 years. Second, it's a confidence-building measure. Success in bond issuances sends a strong message to foreign investors that Egypt is safe to invest in, whether projects or in the stock market.
And the Minister of Finance, Mohammed Maid, confirmed the importance of this borrowing mechanism.
The role of the state is that we manage to solve issues partially through bonds. There was a shortage of hard currency, but we now have hard currency. There was a problem of continuous deficit, but we solved the deficit problem. There were issues with our infrastructure, electricity, roads, transport and gas, but we have managed to solve all of them.
The government says last week's $3.75 billion Eurobond sales to cover part of its $8 billion budget deficit will be the last for this fiscal year 2020-2021 that ends in July.
Minister Mohammed Maid made this decision because Egypt has achieved its target of foreign currency issuances for the year. The state budget has allowed for a $7 billion bond sales, which was covered. The latest $3.75 billion Eurobond sales was oversubscribed, but the government only needed the amount it collected.
Officials are hoping there will be a revival in the tourism industry in the second half of 2021, and that will help to pay the country's next year budget deficit from the tourism revenue rather than from issuing more debt. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
All right, and a quick run through some company headlines. Let's start in the world of retail. ShopRite reported growth in Checkers and Checkers Hyper in South Africa the second half of 2020 amid difficulties in the rest of the continent, where it's made progress concluding its sale of stores in Nigeria. Sales at Checkers and Checkers Hyper were up by over 11% year on year as the group focused on its strategy to open new high-end Checkers stores to attract upper-income consumers. In banking, Equity Banque Commerciale du Congo has launched its new identity following the successful merger of Equity Bank and Banque Commerciale du Congo to form Equity BCDC. Now, the new bank's goal is to have the capability and the talent and the experience to make banking affordable, immediate and accessible to virtually every household in Africa's largest copper producer. MasterCard, the credit card giant company, has announced plans to give its vendors the option of getting payments in cryptocurrencies later in the year. Keep this in mind. We'll come back to Bitcoin later. The move will see the firm join a string of big-ticket firms that have pledged to make similar moves. Now, the announcement comes just days after Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, revealed that the company had not only bought $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin, but it would also be accepting it as a form of payment for cars. And speaking of cars, Jaguar Land Rover's entire range will be fully electric by 2030. Yeah, say goodbye to supercharged V8s here, as the car maker is joining a global race to develop zero-emission models. Now, this is to get ahead of a looming ban on the sales of new fossil fuel-powered vehicles. JLR is owned by India's Tata Motors. It says that the Jaguar brand will lead the way with a fully electric model range built on a brand new platform by 2025. That's a run through your headlines. A fully electric Range Rover. That's going to be interesting. Here's what's coming up next. Nigeria's central bank is cracking down on cryptocurrency trading. And shrinking cargo space and low orders have dampened the Valentine's mood for Kenyan flower farmers. Their stories coming up shortly.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business. Only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Nairo. Hello, Nairo.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. Now, let's head over to Nigeria. It is the world's second largest Bitcoin market after the United States, but it's banned the trading of cryptocurrencies yet again. The Central Bank of Nigeria just last week ordered all banks and financial institutions to immediately close accounts transacting in or operating cryptocurrency exchanges. The CBN also ordered the same banks to identify persons and entities trading in cryptocurrencies within their systems, and failure to comply with that directive allegedly would result in severe regulatory sanction. Now, for Nigerians, cryptocurrencies over the years have become an interesting alternative to the Naira, which has already been devalued twice. Africa's largest economy has faced persistent, pretty deep dollar shortages, partly as a result of a slowdown in economic activities due to the pandemic, reduced oil revenue from its main export, oil as well. Local banks are now restricting transactions with hard currencies and mostly limiting customers to withdraw less than $100 at any one go. All right then, so how did we get here and how is this ban apparently being implemented? Deji Badmus is in Lagos with developments on this particular story. So Deji, let's start with a missive that was sent out on the 5th of February with the CBN demanding that banks identify persons or entities using their accounts to trade in cryptocurrencies and to shut them down. Do we know how many accounts have been closed since then?
Well, not at this time, Ramah. The data is not out yet. Some of the banks actually only started closing down some of these accounts last week. So it's still pretty early to tell how many. I guess the figure will be out much later. So nothing is out yet. But what we do know is that the banks have begun closing down accounts now that are linked to cryptocurrencies, and the process is ongoing. So that's how much we know for now, Ramah.
Indeed. So in explaining its ban, the CBN said, look, this is not new. They're following up essentially on a missive that they sent out in January 2017. But that was, years ago. We were talking about oil price collapses back then. Why is it taking so long to enforce it?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's one question everyone has been asking the CBN. The CBN has not been able to provide a clear answer to that. The truth is, I guess there's something that the CBN knows that most of us don't really know, and the CBN is actually not disclosing it other than what it has put out in a statement and giving reasons why it had to take the action that it's taking. The good thing is that the parliament, senators have now summoned the CBN governor to appear before them. I guess the CBN governor will be appearing before lawmakers sometime this week. And so we might get a clearer picture. Maybe the CBN governor now would be able to tell senators more, give them more reasons why the organization had to take that action now. I just want to believe that there must be some other reasons other than what the CBN had given for taking this action, because this actually happened so suddenly. And do not also forget that it came at a time when a lot of people thought the CBN had made up its mind to regulate, the government as a whole had made up its mind now to regulate the operation of cryptocurrency. Don't forget, SEC was actually moving towards regulating it, but now it has decided to suspend that altogether as a result of the CBN's latest action.
Indeed. So part of the CBN's argument days later was that, and I'm quoting them here, that cryptocurrencies were being used for money laundering, terror financing, and other criminal activities. Now, the thing is, I could make the exact same argument about any other currency, the US dollar, the Kenyan shilling, the naira. So what are the Nigeria-specific cases that they have to prove that Bitcoin was being used for money laundering, terror financing, or other criminal activities?
Another very good question, Rama. Other than those reasons you just mentioned now that the CBN has given, the institution has not given any other reason. But as I said before, there probably might be something that the CBN has seen or actually knows that we don't know. Of course, I mean, there's always been issue with the anonymity, so to speak, in the operation of cryptocurrencies and all of that. That had always been a concern. The CBN actually highlighted that in its first memo in 2007 when it asked everyone to be careful in dealing in cryptocurrencies now. But, you know, terrorism financing, of course, as you said, other than cryptocurrency, even normal legal currencies are actually used for, you know, terrorism financing and all of that. So we just have to wait. Let's see what the CBN governor would be telling the senators. And to be candid, that is what the senators actually want to find out, because these issues, this question you just asked now, the same question was asked at the National Assembly when the lawmakers were debating the action of the CBN. And that's the reason they've decided to summon the governor to come and explain better so that, you know, they can get a better understanding of why the Apex Bank now decided to act the way it did. So we have to wait until the CBN governor appears, and maybe something new will come out, just maybe.
Indeed. One last question for you, Deji. So the CBN can crack down to some extent on banks or payment processors, with the exception of some round-tripping perhaps, which accept Naira deposits to trade in crypto. But peer-to-peer trading, that's something they really can't shut down. Have we seen a rise in peer-to-peer exchanges within the local market ever since this ban came into effect on the 5th of February?
Well, Rama, look, I've been speaking to some operators of some of these exchanges, and what they're saying is that it's still early days yet to give, to actually tell. While some Bitcoin users have actually said that they will definitely migrate to P2P, we haven't seen that mad rush now towards P2P. That's according to some of these operators now. But no doubt at all, a lot of people have said they're migrating towards that channel. But I think some people are actually waiting to see whether there will be more directives from the CBN before they take their position. But obviously, I think in the future, we probably would see more and more people moving towards P2P because obviously, as you've said, the CBN would not be able to control that. But in terms of the figures, percentage of people who are moving there at this moment, too early to call.
Indeed, we'll see how this all plays out. Teji Badmus in Lagos. Thank you. Now, we're still in Nigeria. The country is set for yet another increase in the price of petrol at the pump as crude oil prices are coming closer and closer to $65 a barrel. We crossed the $63 a barrel mark sometime earlier today. Now, the government announced the removal of fuel subsidies last March, allowing for market-based pricing as far as retail prices are concerned. Labour unions in the country have often clashed with the government on several occasions over the issue, as CGTN's Deji Badmus now reports from Lagos.
It's a paradox for Nigeria that the rise in crude oil price is both a source of joy and disagreements. The country needs higher crude prices to show up its revenue, but with about 90% of its domestic refined petrol imported, anytime the price of crude oil goes up, the price of refined petrol rises as well. Until March last year, the government was fully subsidizing the price of petrol. With the subsidy now gone and the price of crude rising, Officials are warning of an impending hike in fuel price.
Today, the NNPC is taking a big hit from this. We all know that there is no provision in the budget for subsidy. And so, somewhere down the line, I believe that the NNPC cannot continue to take this blow. There is no way, because there is no provision for it. So as a country, let us take the benefits of the higher crude oil prices, and I hope that we'll also be ready to take a little pain on the other side, on the side of higher product costs, product prices.
Labor unions in the country have warned that they would reject any form of petrol price increase. The government has opened talks with them to persuade them to change their position. In the public, the issue is dividing opinions.
This policy is a good policy implemented at the worst possible time they can. We all know what COVID has done to the global economy and to Nigeria. We're in a recession. For me, what government should do, if they would be willing to eat humble pie, is to accept that they've made a mistake, is to reintroduce subsidy. So it's not really too unrealistic to ask government to suspend this, their so-called deregulation policy for now, for a 1 or 2 year window, allow the refining sector to blossom, and then deregulate fully in the true sense of it.
The reality is that the government does not even have the wherewithal to continue to subsidize the consumption of petroleum products. And most importantly, the fact that we subsidize petroleum products also means that we are not able to stimulate the refining industry in the country. So over time, you realize that, look, a lot of resources that should have been spent on critical sectors of the economy like education, healthcare, was actually spent on subsidizing petroleum products.
For now, all eyes are on those talks between the government and labor unions. If the government had its way, then petrol pump price will be adjusted upwards pretty soon. But if there's a stalemate, then the country might as well just begin to prepare for another round of general strike. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
The Kenya Flour Council says high taxes, a lack of cargo flights and poor weather in Europe are all combining to weigh down on Kenyan flour exports' outlook for business this Valentine season. Now, this came as a council forecast that the sector, which was hit relatively hard by the effects of the pandemic, would recover by the end of the year. According to KFC, farmers are exporting only 75% of their produce due to a lack of flights and relatively limited cargo space. Kenya exported 170,000 tons of flours in 2020. Europe accounts for nearly 70% of the East African nation's cut flour exports. Coronavirus restrictions had, however, slashed daily orders by half, threatening thousands of jobs in the country. Elsewhere, Tanzania's earnings from travel fell by nearly 60% in December to just over $1 billion. Now, this resulted in a decline in overall earnings from exports of goods and services by over $840 million. Before the global pandemic, tourism was Tanzania's leading source of foreign currency earnings. $2.5 billion was earned from that in 2019. That's according to data from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Tourism. The value of traditional exports also dropped to $8.8 billion in December 2020 from $9.65 billion in 2019. The central bank has attributed the decrease to declines in export values of low production of coffee and cotton, as well as reduced volumes and prices in both tea and sisal. All right, and of course, as we mentioned a little earlier in the day, the WTO finally has a new substantive head. It's a former Finance Minister of Nigeria, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. She made her maiden comment a little earlier. Take a listen.
Really agreeing on more rules. We're the very and only place in the world where countries can bring trade disputes. Does not work. It's paralyzed. So it's a priority to really reform that and take account of the inputs of all members to make sure we come up with a dispute settlement system that works for all. There's the need to modernize the rules of the WTO and bring them up to 21st century issues. What do I mean by that? We have to look at the digital economy, which has become so prominent during this pandemic. E-commerce is key and is going to grow in leaps and bounds as we move on. How do WTO does not presently have rules that underpin e-commerce. So how to put those rules in place, complete the negotiations will be very, very important. Ditto, there are other types of negotiations on investment facilitation, domestic services regulation, etc. These all need to be looked at. And we have a good chance of trying to come to grips with some of them. I must mention the fisheries subsidies negotiation, which is key. Actually, that is perhaps one of the furthest advanced as of now. And it speaks to both sustainability of our oceans. It helps fulfill one of the SDGs. And there's a good chance that at MC12, which is a top priority for all the members, how do we have a the next ministerial 12 that is successful? It provides the venue to conclude on some of these issues I've talked about, agreeing about how to solve the pandemic, even set a framework for future pandemics, agreeing on, the fisheries subsidies negotiations, wrapping that up, and the various other negotiations I mentioned. I forgot, there's one thing that is very important as a priority to me, is also the fact that e-commerce will help us be more inclusive of women and MISMEs, micro, medium, and small enterprises. Trade is about people. And we have to constantly keep that in front of us. How do we bring those who have been excluded or marginalized, like women, like owners of micro, medium, and small enterprises into the mainstream? This is also important. And then let me just mention quickly traditional issues like agriculture should not be forgotten, issues of industrial subsidies, agricultural subsidies, special and differential treatment. These are all very difficult areas that perhaps down the line we will need, we'll definitely need to look into, not perhaps, we'll need to look into them. And then there are also procedural issues. The way that the bodies of the WTO work to make them much more efficient. I've said in my speech that we need to look at procedures for appointing for appointing directors generals. I think I'm in a good shape, having just been named, to talk a little bit and suggest that. Issues of how we make sure consensus does not stand in the way of innovations at the organization, and so on. So a lot to do. But these were some of the things I pointed out as priority areas. So let me stop it there. I should also perhaps end by saying strengthening of the Secretariat. The Secretariat of the WTO has very talented staff, among the best you can find in the world on trade. So how do we help them to work better and support members better? These are some of the things that I think we should be looking at. Thank you.
Thank you. And that, of course, is the new Director General of the World Trade Organization, 66-year-old former Finance Minister of Nigeria, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. We'll certainly be hearing more from her views as far as trade reform is concerned worldwide in the days to come. Now, on to the world's youngest state. South Sudan's government says it will punish those violating measures put in place to curb the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic in the country. This warning comes amid a surge in infections that has forced Juba to suspend its weekly cabinet meetings. Here's Patrick Oyet with the details.
South Sudan is now 2 weeks into a lockdown, but on the streets of the capital, Juba, many are not following the health ministry's guidelines to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. Only a few are wearing face masks. Records from the health ministry indicate that the country is recording more than 150 cases daily. That government says that number may be higher since testing remains low. The lockdown is due to last for a month, but the government is already warning that it could be extended.
I wouldn't determine right now. It will be determined when the health situation is clear to all of us in the country and in the whole world. So depending on what will be given to us by the means of health.
The lockdown means all schools, gatherings at places of worship, social events and sports activities are suspended. Meetings of South Sudan's Council of Ministers are also halted. The government says it will only hold extraordinary meetings if there are emergencies. The new lockdown has affected residents of the capital, Juba, across all sectors.
The government has to help and reduce fuel prices because now the government wants me to carry fewer passengers, which is half capacity of this car. But fuel is expensive. Square parts are expensive. I'm not making money, and yet this is my only source of livelihood.
This lockdown really it has affected us because in terms of transport cost has really risen up, and there's a stiff competition and business is low. Things are not moving on well.
The lockdown is affecting us because even last year they were saying they have put the lockdown. Even with our children at home, they are just there at home, they're not schooling.
The government says people can still travel in and out of the country. However, they must have a certificate to show that they tested negative for COVID-19. The health ministry says there is a surge in the number of people infected with COVID-19. Senior government officials such as the governor of the Central Bank of South Sudan and President Kiir's spokesperson are confirmed to be infected with the coronavirus. The government is urging the public to observe the measures put forward by the health ministry to control the spread of the coronavirus. Patrick Koyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
It's 18:36 GMT, time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. Japanese economic output expands by much more than expected in the final quarter of 2020. And Google and Facebook are close to a deal to pay for news as a new media law comes closer to taking effect in Australia.
Business in Africa is at the crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant.
Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. These are some of the stories making your headlines at this hour. The World Trade Organization's General Counsel has appointed Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as the Director General. The former Nigerian finance minister makes history as the first African and the first woman to lead the WTO. The WTO has lacked a substantive leader ever since Roberto Azevedo resigned in August amid the organization's increasing entanglement in the US and China trade disputes. Elsewhere, data released by South Africa's health ministry shows a decline in COVID-19 infections in that country. The positivity rate now stands at just under 6.5%. That's compared to 10% in the previous 2 months. That said, South Africa still has the highest number of coronavirus cases and related deaths anywhere across Africa. The Sahel Region Security Summit is underway in the Chadian capital of N'Djamena. The meeting brings together leaders from Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania and Niger. It will be held over 2 days, with the French President Emmanuel Macron taking part through a video link. The G5 initiative was started some 7 years ago with the aim of improving regional cooperation, development and security within the Sahel. This year's meeting is expected to address security and terror concerns. And finally, Libya's newly appointed Prime Minister, Abdul Hamid Debba, on Saturday confirmed that he had started working on forming a new unity government. In the meantime, a visit by the head of the Presidency Council to Benghazi has raised hopes of ending Libya's conflict. Mohammed al-Manafi met with the commander of the Libyan National Army, Khalifa Haftar, to discuss unifying Libya's military. That's a run through your headlines. Government data showed that the Japanese economy expanded by a lot more than expected in the fourth quarter of 2020. The country's stronger than expected data came as Tokyo's benchmark Nikkei index jumped by nearly 2% today on hopes of a business recovery. Here's Mayu Yoshida with this report from Tokyo.
It's a record day here in Tokyo. The Nikkei share average closed above the psychologically important 30,000 mark. This 30,000 line is a level we haven't seen since August of 1990, which is over 30 years ago. So it was quite a remarkable day in terms of stock moves in Japan. Japanese stocks have gained a lot, especially since corporate earnings season kicked off 2 weeks ago, as majority of companies surprised investors with positive earnings, and in fact, many of them upgrading their earnings outlook. Keep in mind that the Nikkei has risen roughly 7% in the last 2 weeks alone because at home, as I said, earnings were really good and a vaccine rollout is starting somewhere this week. And data-wise, this morning we saw Japan's GDP data. Now, this GDP data covered the 3 months ending December, and compared to the previous quarter, it showed a 12% growth from the previous quarter as exports continued to roar back and businesses started to invest again. And we're also seeing gains in household spending thanks to government stimulus measures. So all of these factors started to show resilience in the Japanese economy. So investors are betting on economic recovery here, especially after the virus emergency, which is scheduled to end in the next couple of weeks. And that's why all sorts of investors, especially foreign investors, jump to buy Japanese shares with a totally bullish view. As for individuals today, energy and healthcare stocks led gains. And the next benchmark would be the Nikkei's all-time high of 38,900 line, and in order to break that level, the Nikkei would need to gain almost another 30%.
Now, Australia says that the tech giants Google and Facebook are near a deal to pay its domestic media companies for the news content that they generate. This comes ahead of Canberra's move to create the world's first law that would effectively force these digital giants to pay up for news that pops up on its searches or its feeds. Google and Facebook so far have not commented on this development. Both of the tech giants publicly and vociferously opposed this planned legislation. Google, in fact, had actually threatened to shut down its search engine if the law was enacted.
Both the media proprietors and the digital giants, I think, recognise that we have something that is workable here in Australia, something that we can take forward, something that can ensure a sustainable media landscape, and something that will see journalism continued and journalists rewarded for generating original content.
Now, away from the business of media, starting this week, all arrivals in the United Kingdom from more than 30 countries deemed to be high risk will have to quarantine for 10 days in a government-approved facility. The rule applies to UK nationals as well. But are these facilities, hotels included, which are near Britain's major airports, ready, and are there enough of them? Nawija Bahil finds out.
The driver's just left it on the table, but it's for room 640.
Old habits die hard. Occupancy at this London hotel is only about 2% of pre-pandemic levels, but manager Charlie Islam Harry is still doing her usual rounds. The St Giles Heathrow is one of many in the UK that have applied to become official quarantine hotels.
With the quarantine package that we do, we put ample of supplies in there, so there's no need for housekeeping to go in and clean the rooms during this period. So everything is there for the guests to use while they're here.
The 411 rooms here are mostly empty, with just a handful of international passengers using some to self-isolate. From the 15th of February, those arriving in the UK from more than 30 high-risk countries will be whisked off to similar locations.
And this is it, the sort of hotel rooms that people will be staying in. This one has all the usual amenities. There's a bathroom with towels, tea and coffee making facilities, and food will be delivered to your door 3 times a day. The downside is that you have to stay indoors pretty much all of the time for 10 days and pay $2,400 for the luxury of doing so.
The UK government says its quarantine programme is among the strictest in the world. It includes mandatory tests on the 2nd and 8th day after people arrive. Those who flout the rules could face up to 10 years in prison, although critics say the guidance is still unclear. For the businesses involved, there's also a financial incentive. Many buildings like this have been sitting empty for months, losing money. For St Giles, which has 9 hotels across the world, the scheme could be vital for cash flow.
keeping the hotels open will enable us to keep our staff employed. We've been quite lucky here at the St. Giles because we have a good team, a lot of cost control. But it's now been almost a year that this has happened, much longer than what we were anticipating.
It's not just hotels suffering, but the wider travel and tourism industry, which contributes $275 billion to the UK economy. Paul Charles is the founder of Quash Quarantine, a campaign urging the government to reconsider the move.
Every second of every day, thousands of dollars are lost in terms of lost bookings, lost confidence, job losses, and business failures. And the government needs to, I think, really now understand that many businesses in the travel and airline sector are on a cliff edge.
The World Travel and Tourism Council says the sector in Britain could face complete collapse and that this latest move will increase uncertainty. A policy designed to reduce transmission of COVID. It's causing a lot of concern here, even before it's gotten off the ground. Luigi Barkil, CGTN, London.
Normally around the Lunar New Year, Chinese restaurants in Malaysia enjoy some pretty brisk business. But the government over there has imposed some fairly strict curbs as the country battles yet another wave of COVID-19 infections. CGTN's Ryan Melson now looks at how these restaurants are adapting to these restrictions from Kuala Lumpur.
Yi Sang, the prosperity toss. Normally a group ritual performed at crowded restaurants. This year just being done by single families in their own homes.
Just play with the kids. It's just something that I love, the taste and everything, so I can do it only like once a year.
Starting January 13th, the government banned dining in restaurants. And although it eased the rule on the eve of Lunar New Year, a maximum of 2 people sitting a meter apart are allowed at each table. Restaurants have had to adapt to preparing yi sang, dim sum, clay pot rice, desserts, and full dinners for family reunions for delivery.
We still control and maintain the quality for the food. That is very important. We must do nicely presentation. We think about how we serve the delivery food until your house. We still feel fresh.
The ban on dine-in the run-up to New Year meant restaurants had to change their marketing strategies too.
We're constantly developing new recipes to cater to the takeaway market. Apart from traditional marketing, we've also branched out into e-commerce. We're also on GrabFood. So we're doing a lot of unconventional sales channels. We've also recently done Facebook Live, where we have our sales team introducing all the dishes in our menus. So I must say that we've been really busy trying to adapt to these changes.
Such strategies have helped prevent an undoubted setback from becoming a disaster for restaurant owners and their staff.
Someone from the front of house could be answering phone calls, taking up orders and doing a bit of marketing for us. We may even have some people who are doing the deliveries themselves, like in-house deliveries. So it's just a way of keeping everyone busy.
Adaptations that are making sure Malaysians can enjoy their favorite dishes this Lunar New Year, and much as they were intended to look and taste, even if it's just with their immediate families and in their own homes. Ryan Meltzer, CGTN, Kuala Lumpur.
Now, few things scream New York like the ever-present yellow taxicab. It's virtually omnipresent in films, it's ubiquitous in real life, at least in Manhattan. The yellow cab is literally a rite of passage for visitors and New Yorkers alike. But now this charming token of the Big Apple is at risk because of the pandemic. CGTN's Tulisha Balala has that story on What's Hot tonight.
They were omnipresent on the streets of New York day and night, as emblematic of the Big Apple, as the Empire State Building or Yankees caps. But the pandemic has made yellow taxis scarce. They now face an uncertain future.
Before the corona, if you come here, it's full with taxi driver. And it's full, sometimes when you come and we not even stay for 20, 30 minutes. But now we come in here, stay there for 3-4 hours, you know, before you get fare.
widespread working from home, school closures, and no tourists means rides have plummeted for Olivo, as they have for all New York's cabbies. A taxi driver for nearly 3 decades, Olivo has been trying to put a brave face on his situation, joking that he is lucky his wife makes good money as a nurse.
My earnings are actually down about 80%. I went from making maybe $1,000 a week to making maybe $200 or $300 a week. Luckily for me, I have a wife, you know what I'm saying, who works and makes good money. Otherwise, I would also have a rope around my neck.
New York taxi drivers, most of whom are first-generation immigrants, were once able to make $7,000 a month or more if they worked long hours 7 days a week. Competition from Uber, Lyft, or other vehicle-for-hire firms had already drastically dented their income. However, with the pandemic, it isn't free all, says Norman Benaventura, taxi driver for 7 years.
So in the sense of giving up, I thought about it, but then again, if I give up, where else can I go? What else can I do? Those are the questions that I ask myself.
Traditionally, taxis in big cities required medallions, official licenses that allow yellow cabs exclusively to pick up street hails. New medallions are either sold by the city or more commonly bought through auctions. In 2018, 9 for-hire drivers in New York committed suicide under the financial pressure of debt earned on their medallions. 3 of them were yellow cab owner drivers.
That's East River. He right there, he committed suicide. So I lost my brother. I'm heartbreaking. So I sent right there. So we are taxi driver and the owner driver. We are hopeless. Nobody help us.
Out of some 13,000 licenses, only about 5,000 taxis are running regularly at the moment, according to the Taxi Workers Alliance. Some 7,000 others aren't even leaving their garages.
The pandemic has just been devastating. Before the pandemic, ridership had been down by about 50%, but since the pandemic, it's down closer to 90%.
The Taxi Workers Alliance, however, fears yellow cabs will slowly fade out if the city government does not erase drivers' debt. Thuli Shabalala, CGTN.
Quick run through commodity prices for you. Oil prices obviously have been going up fairly strongly, but let's ignore that for the time being. Metals have an equally interesting story. Platinum in particular, prices up by over 20% in barely 6 weeks. They're back to levels we haven't seen in the last 6 years, $1,300 an ounce. Now, part of that is a supply deficit triggered by mine closures amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, and the biggest producer of the metal, that's South Africa. Demand for catalytic converters also partially explains the sustained demand as emission standards, of course, do get increasingly stricter. Brent crude crossed over $63 a barrel. It's back to prices we last saw before the pandemic in 2019. Here's what's coming up next. E-commerce is growing in South Africa as shoppers turn to online shopping amidst lockdown measures.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories.
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Aden, Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg,
Ethiopia,
Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Now, e-commerce was already steadily rising in South Africa, before the pandemic did hit. But now the sector has gotten to new heights of success. For many shoppers seeking to limit possible exposure to the virus, online shopping has not just become a convenient option, it's a growing necessity. With the details, here's CGTN's Julie Shire on Grassroots.
The fashion industry depends on see, feel and buy, but that pattern is being redrawn. Designers now depend on digital sales to keep their businesses going. Online retailer Platform 23 is just over 2 years old, but it wasn't until the COVID-19 lockdown that things took off.
In the beginning of lockdown, when it started last year, March, April, sales were very slow. I think everybody was just concerned about, their income and what's going to happen in this weird and unfamiliar territory that we find ourselves in with COVID. And as time passed, I could see sales increasing significantly.
The digital marketplace connects African designers with consumers. Its main focus is fashion, but with income squeezed during the lengthy lockdown, clothes have moved down the shopping list.
We saw the furniture and decor side rise so much because now people aren't going out to restaurants and things so more. They don't have the reason to really get dressed up, but they've been at home working from home and they just can't stand that rug or that couch or that coffee table anymore. And that's what people were replacing instead of the fashion side.
Online shopping breathed new life into industry after a total slump during the hard lockdown.
E-commerce really has opened up the playground to so many other people to give them the opportunity to be online without having the overheads of a big, expensive brick and mortar warehouse.
South Africa's just come through the second wave of infections and vaccines are yet to be rolled out. Online sales are expected to continue growing with the threat of COVID-19 still lingering. Julie Shire, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
All right, then a quick run through the currencies. Some interesting developments in West Africa with regard to the Naira. It's gone as low as 411.5 to the dollar on the formal interbank market on Monday, down 8% to that point. That's a record low for the currency that has been weakening steadily past the 400 mark. In East Africa, Kenya announced a staff-level agreement with the IMF on a $2.4 billion 38-month program. The program, according to the fund, will focus strongly on raising tax revenues and tight control of spending. But the East African economy's output contracted for 2 straight quarters in 2020. So the precise details of the tax reform measures and the expected performance is the key detail here, and those so far are absent. So then, on the day the Nikkei in Tokyo closed at over 30,000 points for the first time since 1990. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.